I am live. We are in the fourth part of Time Out of Mind, which is the autobiography of Joan Marshall Grant. She lived until 1989, and this book is about the 20s. She is here in, I think she might, I don't know exactly how old she is. Let's see, but she is over 20 anyway. The fourth part, no, chapter 3 in the fourth part of this book. It's entitled Fantasy and Facts. I had a preconceived idea of deserts based on pictures of the rolling sand dunes of the Sahara, so I was surprised to find us driving across utter flame flatness on a surface so hard that the car could steer a course as though it were a motorboat on still water, where there was not even a track, only small sand mounds every few yards erected by the expedition to serve as route markers. We crossed two of the great irrigation canals, which are so wide that 3 cars can still drive along them abreast. There were only 3,000 miles of them. There were once 3,000 miles of them, and until the conquest of the Babylonians by the Assyrians in the 8th century BC, they formed part of a gigantic irrigation scheme which turned a vast area of what is now arid desert into the greatest granary of the ancient world. In the beam of our headlights, the house looked lonely and forbidding as a bean guest fort. Suddenly, we heard a huge sound of wailing. Leslie put on the brakes and got out of the car. "The diggers are up to something," he said, and seemed rather worried. Then he laughed. "It's all right, only a total eclipse of the moon. Come and watch it." It was a very eerie night. The full moon burnt to a dusky red as it was eaten by the black demon of the underworld. The wailing grew louder until at last Allah heard his people's prayers and slew the monster which had dared to swallow the lantern of the night. It was now so late that Leslie thought that everyone would have gone to bed. But a welcoming party was still in progress, and I was delighted to find that archaeologists are far less professorial than my earlier experience of scientists had led me to believe. There were 7 men and 4 women, 5 including me, of assorted nationalities. Hans Frankfurt, the director, was Dutch. Torkjeld and Redgemore Jacobsen were Danish. Pierre was Russian, and Ham and Hull American. The rest were English. Seaton and his exotically beautiful wife, Joan, Rachel, and last, though in my affection she is certainly first, Mary Chap. Logs were burning in the open fireplace of the sitting room. It was another surprise to find that Iraq in midwinter is bitterly cold. In the adjoining dining room there was a lavish cold supper, which I was almost too tired to appreciate. Our bedroom was rather Spartan, for only basic furniture was provided by the exhibition. But we had a bathroom to ourselves, as our room was normally used only by visitors. I had expected to have a wash in a tin basin, which in fact I did for 10 days when Leslie and I were at the subsidiary dig house at Cavaille. But there was no lack of water, although every drop of it had to be brought 12 miles from the canal by truck. The communal living rooms occupied one side of the main courtyard, bare except for eucalyptus trees which Rachel nourished with jugs of her bath water. Lavish baths were considered a necessity, but water for flowers a gross extravagance. On the other 3 sides were bed-sitting rooms arranged in pairs with a bathroom between each. Round the second courtyard were the workrooms, including the one where Leslie did his photography, with its adjoining dark room, and the amba, a long narrow room with a workbench under the 3 windows and bays of shelves on which all the antiques were kept. Round the third courtyard were grouped the kitchen, the house servants' quarters, storerooms, stables and livestock, which included a flock of sheep, 50 at the beginning of the season, none of them at the end of it, when they had done their work as an on-the-hoof store cupboard, and their fleeces were used to pack the antikas. The outer walls were patrolled at night by 2 guards, armed with rifles who were supplied by the government, and were supposed to have at least 1 murder each to its credit. We were officially under the protection of the local sheikh, a delightful old man called Abdul Yebal, who came every payday to collect a percentage of their wages from each of the 200 or so men and boys who worked on the dig. From this levy, he paid any fines demanded by us as a recompense for incidents, such as one during the previous season when a disgruntled or perhaps only trigger-happy Arab had fired 5 bullets into one of the expedition's cars, unfortunately without winging any of the 4 occupants. The dig itself was about a quarter of a mile from the house, until excavation began 4 years before I went there. The town of Tel Asma was a large, roughly circular mound. Sumerians built their new towns on top of the old ones, so to make sure accurately dating buildings and objects, one layer after another was removed, as well as shafts being sunk. During the centuries, the level of the desert had risen, through countless tons of earth being deposited on it by dust storms. The dig was now a huge pit, more than 30 meters deep, and I climbed down into it on a ladder. I wanted to work out there, but was told that as the pride of Arabs does not allow them to take orders from females, I would have to content myself with indoor jobs. However, my second night in Tel Asma produced a magnificent electric storm, which I watched at midnight from the water tower, the only part of the mud brick buildings that was more than 1 story high. No rain fell. In our part of the desert, little rain had fallen for the last 4 years, but gigantic zigzag flashes blazed the night from horizon to horizon. Leslie, when I described the beauty of it to him next morning, said briskly that only an idiot would have offered herself as a lightning conductor on the highest point for a large number of square miles. But fortunately for me, the Arabs took a different view, or else the total eclipse had already been a sufficient sponsor, for a spokesman came to Hans to say that should the magical Mem Sahib with any of them to work for her, they would be more honored to do so. So when I was bored by making scale drawings of pots, a task made even more laborious by calipers and other measuring devices calibrated in inches, which I had to translate into centimeters, I spent the day at the dig. It meant getting up much too early, as work began at dawn. In the cold grey light, I walked the quarter-mile, trying not to see dozens of men performing their morning defecation, squatting naked from the waist down, but apparently convinced that by pulling their abbas up to cover their heads, they were in complete privacy. Perhaps they are the origin of the legend wrongly attributed to ostriches. Having clambered down to the point assigned to me, I then usually spent the rest of the day beside a grave, watching its content being slowly and carefully uncovered. This was not nearly so easy as it would have been had the ground been sandy, as in Egypt, for here it was clay, nearly as hard as cement. At several stages I told the men to stop work while I made rough sketches with exact measurements of where each object lay in relation to another. When sufficient was uncovered, Leslie took photographs before anything was moved to the umbar for detailed examination and cleaning. One skeleton had, instead of the usual food pots and weapons, only a wine cup in his hand and 30 wine jars packed round him, so closely that there was hardly room in the grave for the body itself. There were clear indications that he had been killed by a blow on the forehead. During lunch I started to speculate on the manner of man he had been. Had he died in a wine shop brawl with fellow wine bibbers who felt sorry in the morning that they had been too rough and so clubbed together to give him a good send-off? Or was he a butler caught sampling his master's cellar? Someone hastily changed the subject and Leslie frowned. How often must I be told that we were here to discover facts, not fantasy? For several days I was sufficiently subdued to work industriously and blindly as a mole, and as a gesture of independence began my collection of 4,000-year-old teeth. This occupation was not so macabre as it sounds. Before leaving London, a dentist friend, Mr. G.B. Pritchard, had asked me to look carefully at the teeth of any ancient skulls I encountered, for comparison of their dental condition with that of contemporary man. What began as a chore became a real interest, which I could get no one else to share. I became a tooth bore, until the subject was forbidden at meals. Children's teeth, middle-aged teeth, teeth of men who were so old that the surface of the molar was ground almost smooth, and in none of the 40 sets I collected was there a single decayed tooth, nor a jaw abscess, nor a wisdom tooth that had not grown in exact alignment with the rest. I packed them lovingly in little cardboard boxes, with as much data as I could find about the previous owners. But they never got to England, for at the end of the season, Sitton made me bury them in case they were found by the customs, who might think that we had tried to evade the government's decree that nothing should be taken from the dig except the half share of all fines allowed by our permit. In another grave on which I worked, a woman still held a copper mirror in her skeleton hand, and a green eyeshadow and a caul, the rouge and the powder in jasper and sardonyx jade jars at her side was still so little changed that I could have made up my own face with them. On a bronze ring held by a lapislazuli ram were threaded toilet instruments, eyebrow pluckers, a little scoop for pushing back the cuticles of the nails, a spike to clean them, and a thing like a miniature salt spoon with a hole in it, which I identified from having seen one like it in a Victorian dressing case as being intended for removing blackheads. She wore several bracelets and armlets, and an intricate headdress of tiny beads on which Sitton poured melted paraffin wax, so that the pattern could be exactly reconstructed. One by one I freed the beads from the wax, when they had hardened on the skull, and with a fine needle strung them on a fresh thread. I kept the skull for several days on my bedside table, which caused no comment, as we often worked in our room instead of in the umbar. But I never dreamt of her, and her bones, her other discarded possessions, gave me nothing to add to the bare facts which I already knew, that she had died young, had small, delicate bones, and had lived nearly 4,000 years ago. I was in the umbar, carefully clearing the clay from the incised lines of a cylinder seal preparatory to rolling it on plasticine to make a record of its design, when I suddenly found myself tuning in. No one except Leslie was there, so I told him to grab a pencil and began to dictate. This was worn on the left shoulder. It was on a copper pin, which had an almost right-angled bend in it. Beyond the bend, there was a little cross piece to prevent the seal from falling off. By holding the pin, one could roll the seal backwards and forwards, like a rolling pin. The pin was very sharp and could be used as a dagger, but usually it was used to hold the cloak together on the left shoulder. It belonged to someone who had a lot to do with building. At first I was disappointed that I should have broken his rule of no spooks with something so uninteresting, but Leslie was quite excited, and from one of the shelves took a pin, which had been found early in the season, that was exactly like the one I had described. These are not uncommon, but they are supposed to be hair ornaments, he said. Which we now know to be nonsense, I replied. Do we? Said Hans, who had come in through the far door while I was still dictating, without either of us noticing him. There was no point in trying to assemble. It says here in a footnote, the notebook in which Leslie wrote this and other dictations also mentioned in part 4 has survived. This one is headed Amethyst Cylinder Seal from Ishali, February 1935. I plunged into such an abbreviated account of how I had come to the psychometry that it probably sounded even less plausible than it need have done. He admitted that nearly all cylinder seals have a hole bored through them, but maintained that this was so that they could be worn around the neck on a cord. But it would be so much easier to roll them if they were on something stiff, I protested. Look, Hans, I thread one of my hairpins through this one and show you how much easier it is. He said amiably that mine was quite a logical theory, but only a theory, and that theories were rather unwise for people whose primary object was facts. About a month later, I was fitting potsherds together, which I enjoyed, as it was like playing a jigsaw puzzle, made even more difficult by some of the pieces being missing, when Hans came into the umbar with a party of visitors. I didn't listen to what he was saying, as by then I knew most of the obvious questions they were likely to ask and the routine answers, until I suddenly heard him say, "That pin was used to hold a cylinder seal like the one I have already shown you. Not only did the pin make it easier to use the seal, but it served to fasten the cloak, and being in its original state, very sharp, it could even be used as a weapon." I was hidden from Hans by one of the bays of shelves, but I now put my head around the corner and winked broadly at him. He blushed and raised his voice a little. These pins used to be classified as hair ornaments, but in the light of more recent knowledge, their real purpose has been discovered. On another of our digs, an inscription has been found on a clay tablet in cuneiform, which describes how a certain court official stabbed another man to death with his seal. Archaeology is largely a matter of fitting facts together. He beamed at me and introduced me to the visitors. Fitting facts together, as I was saying, much as Mrs. Grant here is so patiently gluing together these shards so as to discover scientifically the conformation of the original pot. Chapter 4. Mare and Nightmare. Ghazala, my Arab mare, was the colour of pale copper, with a white mane and tail. She at last cured me of the illusion that I am a natural horsewoman. When I first arrived, she had a strained tendon, or so the Arab groom told Leslie, who did not ride her himself, as Sheikh Abdul-Jabbar, who had sold her to him for £15, said she was not up to his weight. She had delicately flared nostrils like Gladys Cooper, and might have trotted out of a medieval Persian painting. I lavished affection on her, cajoled her with carrots, sugar, sweet biscuits, and lettuces, which she daintily accepted, although she was already brim-full of wheat and maize. She looked rather too fat, but I ascribed this to overfeeding. At last, the groom, a wizened man smaller than an English jockey, could think of no more excuses to prevent me riding her. I waited until everyone was safely out of the way, for I wanted to practice without an audience, and dressed myself in my lovely new riding clothes. Ghazala must have had some trace of affection for me in her rebellious heart, or else known I had sugar in my pocket, for she let me lead her around the side of the house and stood docilely while I mounted. For the first half-mile she cantered smoothly as a rocking horse. I glowed with pride in us both, hands and heels down, spine erect, but relaxed. I might have been doing it straight out of the book. Then she stretched out her neck, took the bit firmly between her teeth, and bolted. Frantically I pulled on the reins, but I might as well have tried to stop an express train with a skipping rope. I got a stitch in my side, and the grip of my knee, which was always feeble, began to melt away. I wrapped the reins round my wrist and clung to her mane with one hand and the saddle with the other. At last she began to slow down a little, but she was still going far too fast for me to relish the idea of sliding onto such iron-hard ground. Like a fool I tried to assert my authority by pulling on one rein with both hands, which, so I had read somewhere, caused the bolting horse to turn in ever smaller circles until it had to stop, knowing itself mastered. But all this trick did was to annoy Ghazala, who knew more tricks by instinct than ever got into a textbook. She sprang into the air, undulating like a sea serpent, and jerked the reins, which were still round my wrist, so violently that she dislocated my shoulder. My howl of pain must have startled her, for she stopped and stood quivering, while I clambered off her and she stared at me in unutterable disdain. By hanging on to the stirrup leather, I managed to click my shoulders back into place, but it was still far too painful to pull myself back into the saddle, even though Ghazala seemed to, at last, have run out of steam. The house looked small as a toy in the far distance, and I began to trudge towards it, dragging Ghazala behind me like a sled. The groom, who knew his hideous secret, that, far from exercising her every morning and evening, he had never taken her out of the stable yard once he found that she was virtually unbroken, was about to be discovered, had been watching me from the top of the water tower. To add to my humiliation, a truckload of yelling Arabs, intent on earning kudos for retrieving me, came rattling across the desert. They implored me to get into the truck, but I was in no mood to be rescued, and if I couldn't get home on my horse's hoofs, I could at least do so on my own feet. Ghazala too was sulking, and tried to nip me, unless I held her close to the bit, which was disgustingly slimy with froth. The truck, with its cargo of bewildered and now silent Arabs, ground after me in bottom gear. The Mem Sahib might be magical, but it was certain that she was also mad, and such persons are under the protection of Allah. The venal groom removed himself during the night, and the other one told me that the reason for Ghazala's stoutness was that within 4 months she would bear me a foal. I thought I would be glad to know that Leslie had been so clever as to buy 2 horses for the price of 1, but I had other plans for her. As soon as I could drive a car, I went off alone, which was strictly forbidden, to Sheikh Abdul Jabbar's village. He met me at the gates and escorted me to his house, where, seated beside him on a pile of precious carpets, turbulent with fleas, he fed me with his own hand. I knew this was a great honor for an Arab to offer to a woman, so I tried to appreciate the sheep's eyes, the hard-boiled eggs, grey with the dirt from his hands as he peeled them. It is surprisingly difficult to bite a small boiled egg without nipping the hospitable fingers in which it was offered. The pigs of tangerine, from which he carefully removed the pips with his long, beautiful nails before popping them into my mouth, held open for him like a hungry fledgling's. The curious meal took place in the garden of his house, an orchard of tangerine trees. Would I accept some tangerines? Basket after basket of fruit, as delicious as they were beautiful, among their leaves and sweet-smelling flowers, were stripped from the branches and laid at my feet. Was there nothing else he could implore me to accept? In a corner of the garden there was a clump of hollyhocks. Would it be too unkind, I wondered, to ask him for the only flowers I had seen since I came to Iraq? He beamed, enchanted by my exquisite manners. I was truly of Allah, for how otherwise could I, a foreigner, have paid him the delicate compliment of indicating that to so humble a person as myself the weeds in his garden would seem a rich gift? Only when he and most of the villagers had escorted me to the car, which was now so full of tangerines and hollyhocks that it would have looked at home on the French Riviera during a battle of flowers, did he introduce the subject of Ghazala. He had heard that she was to bear a foal, and as I, a fact almost too sad to be spoken of, would by that time have flown away to my own country, might he buy the little mare back from me? Graciously I accepted his kind offer, relieved that I had the sense to wait for him to introduce the subject, instead of offering her to him as a gift, which had been the purpose of my visit. He gave me an envelope. I put it unopened in my bag as courtesy demanded. He bowed. Everybody bowed. I drove away through a lane of cheering children. When I opened the envelope, I found £25 in it, 10 more than Leslie had paid for Ghazala. I had been in Iraq about a month when I woke in the middle of the night with an agonizing dream. I could still feel Gillian's arm clinging around my neck and hear her wailing, "Don't let them cut my tummy open, Mummy. Don't let them cut a hole in me. Mummy, I need you." With tears streaming down my face, I woke Leslie and began throwing things into an overnight bag. "What on earth are you doing?" he protested sleepily. "Gillian is going to have an operation. She needs me. For God's sake, stop gawping. Get dressed and fetch the car. He tried to reason with me, but soon began to share something of my anxiety. He refused to start until dawn on the logical, but at the same time infuriating pretext that it was useless to hurry, as the bi-weekly plane was not due to leave until the following day, that it was impossible to telephone to England, and that the Baghdad post office did not open until 9 o'clock. I was rattling the post office door for several minutes before a clerk reluctantly offered it a quarter of an hour too early. At first he was disgruntled, but after I had sent a long cable to Mother, demanding to be told full details of Julian's illness, however serious it might be, he became sympathetic and gave me a glass of tea. After booking a place on the next day's plane and going to the bank, I went back to the post office every half hour to find out whether the answer to my cable had arrived. When at last it came, just before closing time, the clerk ran out into the street, where I was huddled miserably in the car, jubilantly waving the cable form and shouting, "Good, Madam Mem Sahib. It is good, good." I was so close to tears that I could hardly see to read. "All well with Gillian, darling. Don't worry writing, Mother." I ran to find Leslie, who was exhausted by trying to calm me down, had retreated to the hotel bar and told him the glorious news. "Next time you have a few such dream about our child, I suggest you keep it to yourself," he said grimly. "Thank God I had the sense to stop you making a fool of yourself in front of the others. I told them you wanted to do a long day's shopping as an excuse for starting so ridiculously early." We had dinner in silence, and I ate far more than he did, for relief from anxiety usually makes me ravenously hungry. In silence, too, we stalked out to the car, and only spoke to each other when we got involved with a herd of camels, which were waiting to cross the river, and they began kicking the car. The noise was extraordinary, as though we were midgets enclosed in a bass drum. It is difficult to sulk when entirely surrounded by angry camels, as they look so absurdly like some of one's least favourite acquaintances. But there was still a coldness for several days, so I was pleasantly surprised when he rather embarrassedly kissed me before handing me a letter which was addressed to him in Mother's writing. The letter has not survived, but I remember it so well that it is near enough the original text as it makes no matter. "Dear Leslie, from Joan's cable, poor child, how worried she must have been. I can only hope you were kind to her. I know she must have sensed the danger to Gillian. I'm writing to you so that you can use your discretion as to whether to tell her all, or if you think it's wiser not to remind her of it, in case it makes her worry. You know I take every care of Gillian, and so does Miss S. I dislike the woman, but I think she's efficient in her own way. I watch her closely, and she seems kind to the child. But accidents happen, however careful one is, especially with such an independent and intelligent child as Gillian. I tried to warn her against danger, but I confess it never occurred to me that she would think of unscrewing their lavatory paper container. In Jack's lavatory too, where she is not supposed to go, but I suppose she left it too late and had to use the nearest one, poor child. It, they used to have now been removed from all the other WCs, was fixed to the wall with a bolt, a wicked thing with a screw thread, 3 inches long, as thick as my little finger, with a knob on the top of it, the kind that makes a spanner. I've often told the child never to put anything in her mouth, but she did, and managed to swallow it. She came to me and told me what she had done, so sensible of her, and I at once gave her quantities of rich plum cake. This, as John may have told you, was exactly what I did when Westray, it was during the war, so he must have been about 10 years old at the time, swallowed the wheel of his toy engine. They operated on him. His stomach was really a dreadful sight afterwards, with scars like a hot crossed bun. Needlessly, for since the x-rays the nurse in the hospital had never watched his bowel movements, and it had found its own way through. I told the nurse she ought to be soundly thrashed, but I always believed in taking every precaution, as you know, Jack, and I, Miss S. officiously insisted on coming too, took Gillian to Portsmouth and had her x-rayed. The report was doubted the report was grave. The bolt in such a bad position and so large that they doubted whether it would pass. We booked a room in the nursing home, quite a good one considering that it's not in London, and a very civil matron, and arranged for a surgeon to be ready when we wanted him. Dr. May said he really is a good man, and there was no point in telling Arthur Bedard to send one down from London. It's Jack's fault that I did not cable Joan the moment it happened. He insisted that she would not be able to get here before the operation. Either Gillian would be safely over it, or it would be too late by the time her mother reached her. But the plum cake and my prayers were enough, and the bolt passed through her next morning without any trouble. You can imagine how thankful we were. I hope Joan is well. I know how she worries. Look after her and do try to make her wear a hat. I always fear sunstroke. Jack sends his love to you both and wishes me to tell you he is keeping the bolt carefully locked up in his desk, as you will want to see it when you get home. I hope you're enjoying your digging. Your affectionate mother-in-law, B. Marshall. So, that's nice. Chapter 5 is entitled The Rain Came.